Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Kotch. I'm the Managing Director of Urban X, the accelerator for startups reimagining city life, built by Mini and Urban Us. Over the last 4 years, we have built a portfolio of 57 companies working with and in cities. And while we're focused broadly on decarbonization and resilience, we see massive opportunity from changing dynamics in urban mobility. And if we want to address the climate crisis in a meaningful way, I think we have to start with the fact that 29% of US greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. So today we're going to unpack some of the most critical recent developments that provide indications of where cities are going and discuss how we can transform mobility from business as usual to maximize public benefit. Given the current state of affairs, I wanted to start with a quote from Derek Thompson, who's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the host of the podcast Crazy/Genius. And Derek recently wrote, the 21st century city is the child of catastrophe. The comforts and infrastructure that we take for granted were born of age-old afflictions: fire, flood, pestilence. Our tall buildings, our subways, our subterranean conduits, our systems for bringing water in and taking it away, our building codes and public health regulations, all were forged in the aftermath of urban disasters by civic leaders and citizen visionaries. While some have forecast the demise of the city, we believe in creative reinvention. We're in the midst of regulatory and technological breakthroughs that are enabling a new generation of leaders to build back better. Today, I'm joined by 3 of those leaders who've been at the forefront of transformative and impactful work in this area for years. Shin-pei Tsay is Director of Policy, Cities, and Transportation at Uber, which is working to help drivers, riders, delivery partners, and eaters get moving in more than 600 cities around the world. Stephen Smyth is co-founder and CEO at COORD, which helps cities manage their streets, starting with the curb. And Lilly Shoup is Interim Executive Director at Urban Movement Labs, a first of its kind collaboration between local government and mobility companies to make Los Angeles the transportation innovation capital of the world. So I'm going to start with Shin-pei. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and maybe share the most critical thing that you're working on today, and also the most interesting mobility company or organization that you've come across recently. And it can't be your own, and it can't be one of your fellow panelists.
Too bad. I would have said, yeah. Well, thanks, Micah, and it's really great to be here. A little bit about maybe on top of mind for me and my team at Uber is a recent sustainability commitment that the company made to be 100% EV by 2030 in the US and Canada and around the world by 2040. But I think even more importantly are the resources that we're directing in the next 5 years. So by 2025, $800 million to helping drivers transition to EVs. And I think, so that's like top of mind. We also released our carbon emissions and have set ourselves on this track of being incredibly transparent about our process, and a lot of work is in front of us. So I'm just going to leave it there, but that's sort of top of mind. Want to talk about, we can't do EVs without multimodal context, et cetera. But I think in that vein, the company that or the organization I was really excited to learn more about today is a civic organization called City Rise. It was created in New York City to basically deal with the lack of action from city leaders around transforming streets in the face of COVID. And given that mobility is changing so rapidly, it is a really important moment to consider how things might be done differently and what sort of temporary changes are needed and what sort of permanent things are needed. And it's vital to the health of the city and to people in the city. And so I really believe in civic infrastructure. So I was really excited to hear that was created in New York.
Very cool. Very, very cool. Very timely as well. Stephen, let's move to you. Same question.
Sure. So in terms of things that I'm working on right now, just to step back for a second. So COORD, we help cities manage their streets. We're essentially turning streets into software is kind of how I think about it, and starting with curb space And so there's sort of two sides to that equation. There's cities that manage the space and operate the space. So we think of that as kind of the supply side. And then on the other side, we see a growing share of use coming from fleets, whether it's fleets moving people, fleets moving goods. And I think on the last point in particular, you know, it was already a trend clearly with e-commerce and such, but you know, the pandemic has clearly highlighted there's just been a step function growth in the use of curbs for pickups and deliveries of things of all shapes and sizes, meals to couches, etc. And so, you know, there's been just I think it just generally a higher perception or value, or the curb space has sort of been repriced away in people's minds, or revalued as it's being used, you know, to run restaurants, as parklets, never mind, you know, as sort of loading zones, sort of mini warehouses on street sides. And so we are, you know, we're in the middle of that, I guess, to put it simply. And so it's been a very busy time for us. You know, when COVID first hit the US, like all startups, you know, wondering what this would mean for us. And it has really, I think in general, accelerated the pace of change at the curb. And so for us specifically, in terms of what we're working on, it's what we call smart zones. And so we actually just launched our first smart zone in the US in the city of Omaha, Nebraska. We actually announced it this week. Or sorry, we did the actual rollout this week. And it basically helps commercial drivers, so think parcel delivery services, meal delivery services, as well as service vehicles, to basically find, book, and pay for loading zone space. And so it's, you know, it's a lot of and this happened essentially over a 2-month period that we basically we announced the agreement with the city in June, and then obviously started operating just this week. And with more to come over the coming weeks. So Aspen, Nashville, West Palm Beach, or sorry, coming months, I should say. And so so that's been, you know, an acceleration essentially in our efforts as we help cities to manage this space, in particular as it relates to the movement of goods. And so as you can imagine, that's been keeping us pretty busy. And also the challenge of rolling out such a program remotely. You know, we're based in New York City. Omaha, Nebraska is, you know, several thousand miles away. And, you know, at first blush, that's sort of, you know, that's tough, right? But we sort of turned that into an opportunity, I think, to figure out how we can actually deploy these types of services relatively quickly and in a scalable fashion. So I think it's a challenge that I think has made us better, and also working with the city to figure out how to deploy these types of programs remotely. And so that's been a great learning experience. In terms of organizations that I think are doing particularly interesting things these days, I definitely, Shin-pei stole my thunder on that New York-based organization, near and dear to my heart, being based here, but LA Tech Incubator, so another organization on another coast, is one that I think is doing really interesting work, and particularly in their number of pilots that they're rolling out in the coming year. So they're I think, you know, staying on mission, staying on task in these uncertain times, and doing a lot of great work in the LA region. So I think that's also, I think, a good organization to call out, and one that I appreciate.
Yeah, we like the folks at Lacey a lot. Thanks, Stephen. Lily.
Yeah, great. So Lilly Shoup, and I, as Micah mentioned, am serving as Interim Executive Director of Urban Movement Labs. Urban Movement Labs was created earlier this year as a nonprofit organization in Los Angeles that partners with public sector transportation agencies, so the port, the airport, and the city transportation departments, alongside private sector companies and technology startups to deploy and test new mobility projects in the streets of Los Angeles. We see ourselves as sort of a matchmaker to identify mobility challenges within the city, and then find technology companies or technology ideas that could help address those specific mobility challenges. So part of the role that Urban Movement Labs plays is as a sort of sister or cousin to LACY, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, by finding ways to put pilot projects in the ground and have learnings generated from those pilots that help the company as they expand and scale, but also help the city to conceive of what policies or regulations might be needed to address those technologies. And then perhaps most importantly, allows the public, the citizens of Los Angeles, to experience firsthand what technologies look and feel like, and be able to provide feedback on those projects in their community. So in that way, I was going to mention LACY as a great organization that we work with all the time, and really love their focus, sort of relentless focus on zero emission zones, and most recently on delivery. But instead of that, I will mention ITS America, which is an organization that's been around for a long time, the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. But recently, I've been very involved with their Mobility on Demand Alliance, and they're facilitating a lot of these very difficult conversations, frankly, between private sector technology companies and state, local, and federal government transportation departments around what does it mean to create public-private partnerships, and how could we achieve mutual benefits there. So really excited to see where they go in those conversations in the coming year.
Yeah, very, very cool. We're going to come back to the on-demand mobility conversation and the state of play there. So in an important step in decarbonizing transportation, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, recently signed an executive order banning new sales of gasoline-powered passenger vehicles starting in 2035. And transportation electrification and multimodal zero-emission concepts for cities have been around for a while. But I'm curious to know, like, what's changed? What are cities, states, and subnational actors grappling with in the absence of national action? Lily, you want to stay there for a sec?
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, really exciting to see that announcement. It comes on the heels of several other sort of policy approaches. So I think the House earlier this year, announced that they were going to, or were passed legislation that would be zero emission by 2035. The Biden campaign has made similar sort of zero emission policy approaches. And I think that's exciting to see, because I really do think we need to set ambitious targets and then have the leadership to figure out the different levers that we need to make to get there. But as you say, I think this is a question where we need sort of all levels of government, as well as the market and the technology companies, to have a seat at the table to both drive the innovation and then just develop the business models for what might work. I think the announcement, and Shin-pei can maybe speak to the announcement earlier this year from Uber, as a great step or example of a company really committing to an ambitious target, and then doing the testing now to figure out what's the best way to get there.
Yeah, Shin-pei, you want to pick that up?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. I think that's absolutely right. It was really, it's not that we have all the answers, but as a global company, one of the things that I thought was really meaningful, I've been at Uber for a year, is that we had the experience of kind of following along some of the pioneers around the world as they were trying to do this. So Amsterdam started making these investments 10 years ago. And they're at a point now where in 2 years, they're going to transition away from public subsidies of charging infrastructure to a completely private market for charging infrastructure. And that's one of the key barriers, frankly, in this entire ecosystem that needs to be built out with electrification. And if we can really hone in on then, rather than thinking about vehicles sold, like we do not want to replicate car-dominant built environments with electrification, right? That's not the goal. The goal is to decarbonize, to move as many people as possible in the most efficient way as possible, to make cities great places and use mobility as a tool to support that. So if the goal is that, then you want to focus the effort on vehicles that get a high utilization. And so that was kind of like the sweet spot, I think, that ride-hail companies can provide, highly utilized vehicles. They're used in all sorts of different ways, but then also for rides, and they replace rides that other people might be taking in their own car, or And so you're getting the electric vehicle kilometers traveled or miles traveled versus, you know, cars sold. And I think that's really important, that we're not necessarily trying to push up sales, but we're creating a completely different environment. So yeah, it was really exciting to see, and obviously the technology, which I know less about on the vehicle side and the battery side, but that's also converging. But I think it's really important to keep in mind this overall ecosystem of the urban environment that we're really trying to support. It's not replication of like post-war highway building.
Right. Yeah, I think it's quite difficult for policymakers in particular to embrace a more holistic view that incorporates both policy and technology and markets to really kind of cement that shift. And I do think that some cities, like, and Amsterdam is a great example of this, where there's also you know, a culture, I think, that embraces the shift to a low carbon economy. But I'm curious to know, like, from your perspective here in the States, what is that right combination of policy and technology and market developments that you think need to happen in order to get us to zero emission transportation at mass scale? And
I mean,
yeah, and of that, and once we get there, how much of the whole pie can be served by an on-demand electric fleet versus private vehicle ownership and mass transit?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think people should be pretty clear-eyed about on-demand, like ride hail in general. We just, in our report, we did a whole analysis on the growth of our business from 2017 to 2019. Business grew significantly. It grew 35%, but carbon intensity, which is the metric that the California Air Resources Board uses to measure the emission carbon impact of vehicles, went down 6%. So while our business grew 35%, our carbon intensity went down 6%. So this is the kind of trend that we have to accelerate, right? Like, we need to meet growing demand at the same time that we're driving down carbon significantly. And we frankly have to accelerate that decrease. But ride hail, on-demand ride hail, is, in our analysis looking at publicly available federal data, was 0.54% of all trips taken. The majority of trips taken are in private vehicles. 92% are in private vehicles. And what we find is that is where we really need to be getting people, you know, like, that's where you're going to have, if those trips can be replaced by electric vehicles or be shifted, or there's a mode shift, that's where you're going to get to zero. But you can see the significant challenge that's in front of the US to make that happen. And it has to be reinforced at all levels of government, because you have to set, you know, at the federal level, these targets, the incentives perhaps for industry. The state level, I think CARB is doing a great job. The clean mile standard is essentially the carbon intensity metric, and setting that metric allows the market to feel comfortable making this very risky decision that, you know, ultimately you can see the writing on the wall, will ultimately be held to that standard. We should get there on our own, try to beat ourselves, trying to get there. And it's good. It's a win-win for us and our customers.
Mm.
Just to echo that, I think that's where the ecosystem really comes into play, because if we do just focus on electric vehicles in the current ecosystem, they will become private electric vehicles. And what we really need to see is a greater diversification within both the service models, but also the kinds of vehicles on the road. So more 6 to 12 passenger vehicles that are all electric, increasingly electric scooters and bicycles that can also go farther distances, can stop to fill in those gaps. But we need to see that investment and enthusiasm from the policy and the funding side across the spectrum in order to sort of see the impact that we want to see.
Yeah. So
yeah,
go ahead, Stephen. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, to me, I think you mentioned the executive order from Gavin Newsom. Like, I think that clearly is a decisive step, right? But I think we can also agree that we don't have a minute to lose in this fight to save the planet. And, you know, we look at the world sort of through the lens of incentives. And so, yes, there's one incentive that essentially Gavin Newsom has given car manufacturers if they want to sell in the state of California. But what happens between now and then? It's sort of it's like healthcare. There's prevention and then there's treatment, right? And we already obviously have the vast majority of vehicles on streets today are internal combustion engines. If we wait around for all of the vehicles to turn over and become electric, we're out of time. And so I think we can't just do one thing or the other thing. I think we have to immediately, as quickly as possible, create the right incentives. And so that's one of the reasons I raised Lacey earlier, the sort of zero emission delivery zones. So creating the incentives in that case for electric vehicles. But also, if you consider that about a quarter, I believe the statistic is about a quarter of carbon emissions come from freight trucks. About a quarter of the time spent by those freight trucks, in their trips, in their journeys, is actually in the last mile looking for parking. Again, we sort of look at the world through the lens of street space and curbs, and using price essentially as an incentive. And there's just so much more that we can be doing to treat, for want of a better term, the current problem, the current illness, if you will, which is the internal combustion engine creating those carbon emissions. That is sort of neither one nor the other. And I worry that if we keep focusing on the sort of the 10-year, the 20-year goal in terms of zero emission, selling a certain number of vehicles by a certain time that are zero emissions, there's all the time in the meantime that we've wasted. And so it's that's why we're passionate about curb space, because it's like this piano. It's kind of my mental model that a city can play from a policy perspective to really encourage changes in behavior. And sort of behavioral economics 101 is that's what prices do, right? So if you price the space, and not strictly pricing as a form of payment, but also privileges, for want of a better term, for like the zero emission delivery zones, or back in the day in California, when Priuses were first a thing, they had the privilege of using a high occupancy lane, the HOV lanes, and that was something of value, right? And so I think that curb space, and sort of to bring it back to this pandemic that we're unfortunately in, has really highlighted the value of this space, and whether it's explicitly priced with a price tag or not, it has value and can be allocated in ways that drive policy. And top policy objective obviously is zero emissions, or reducing carbon emissions, I guess, as quickly as possible. So I think that I just wanted to call out kind of that it's sort of the pincer movement of prevention and treatment, I would argue, that needs to be sort of the framework to address carbon emissions.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was having a conversation with a friend who's a planner yesterday, and he talked about the use of curb space for commercial businesses, for restaurants and mom and pop shops, etc. Then he also kind of brought out the recreation piece, and the ability to actually use some of that space for people to play with their kids and things of that nature. And the ways that you can use policy to help increase quality of life, walkability, and neighborhood enjoyment, I think is really interesting as well. I want to build on this by asking a question about priorities. So you think about people and products, and I'll throw out profitability as well. How should we be thinking about mobility in the second half of 2020 and 2021? What are the real priorities? We spent a little bit of time on passenger vehicles. Now we're moving into freight. Maybe I'll start with you, Shin-pei, since Uber kind of sits on both sides of that market.
I actually think the biggest priority for the transportation community is to figure out how to shore up transit operations and instill trust among riders about safety. There has been not a single COVID case traced to a transit ride. And in many other cities around the world, transit systems never came, and were shut down. And so I think that is actually going to help the transit agencies also have a better sense of which routes they really want to conserve as they're facing incredible challenges, losing both fare revenue, but also local revenue. Many transit agencies around the U.S. are dependent on local revenue, and that's been very compromised during COVID. And so I think that is fundamental. It's a backbone of our cities. And I think even for all the shared on-demand mobility providers, I think they do well when transit does really well. They do the best in cities that transit. So I think there's a really strong link there.
Yeah, I was going to raise that point as well. So I think that that's really job number one for the mobility industry, and it's not just altruistic, as Shin-pei points out. Like, I think it is sort of the backbone that allows for a person to think that they can live without a car, right? I don't think that they can, that's realistic. I think if there's not a transportation system that has depth and breadth, if you will, in a given city. And so I think that's job number one. And I think that the public health point is noted and accurate. I think that there's not actually, as far as I know, been a case that's been traced back to subway use. And I live in New York, so I'm very, very aware of and sensitive to this topic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just am curious to know, like, do you have thoughts about that? Because there does still seem to be some psychological barriers. I mean, I know that here in New York, I was just looking at some data from the MTA the other day. So subway ridership is down like 70% year over year. Bus ridership is down like 50%. And Shin-pei raised this great point around revenue. Here we also have issues around service reductions. And there's talk about, the transit death spiral. So how do we get out of that? How do cities change some of that stigma around public transit? And then what's the outlook moving forward, absent a massive federal bailout?
Yeah, well, I would say that I think we've identified that funding is essential and must be a part of the equation. But I think that to the point Shin-pei and Stephen made, we shouldn't be seeing transit as needing a bailout or in isolation from the broader transportation system. Transit is part of the broader system and must be, and so we need to reinforce that both in terms of the funding we provide, making sure it's stable year to year, making up for the gap in the transit, a lot of transit agencies for the past, 6 months or so, but also looking ahead to providing ample and sustainable funding over time. But we know from being transit riders that it's not just that the bus comes, but it's all of the other supportive systems that make the bus a great option for getting around. And that includes things not just money, but also thinking more broadly about the ecosystem of service. So first, last mile bus or using micromobility connections for that, making sure that you have real-time arrival information and making it easy for people to pay for their ticket. All the way up to, street design changes that put into bus priority lanes and signal priority. These are all things that make transit work great. And that, in addition to providing sort of the COVID safety messaging, can also make people aware that transit is a great option and a competitive option for getting them where they need to go.
But would you argue that regardless of whether it's mass transit or micromobility, that there's some subsidy required? And is there a fundamental question as to who pays that subsidy? Is it the taxpayer, or is it Silicon Valley, or is it the shareholder? Like,
yeah,
I just raised this issue of profitability because I think it's really fascinating, right? We expect the public to subsidize mass transit. And yet again, in a lot of the models that we've seen around micromobility, it's actually the valley and deep-pocketed investors who are subsidizing the cost of each ride. There's not a real profitable micromobility company out there that I'm aware of.
Lily, did you want to finish? I think you were onto something. Please go ahead. And I'll follow up.
Go ahead. Yeah, well, I was just going to say that the entire transportation system is subsidized. We pay for paving roads, we pay for planning studies, we pay for utility connections. So saying that transit is getting a bailout or is getting a massive subsidy is actually not quite accurate. And the real question is, what is the sort of broader social benefit that we as a society get from different types of transportation systems? And if you're prioritizing, you know, equity and sustainability and safety, then transit has to be at the top of the list, regardless of the funding that would be needed to make that a competitive option. Go ahead, Shin-pei.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize, I was just going to say, I actually think we over subsidize private car driving. Parking is underpriced or free in many cases. And it's a very, it can feel like an intractable problem because there's such a lack of political will around taking away those things that have been subsidized once you have them. And I frankly think there is some, you know, there's been conversation about like a greater transparency around the positive code benefits of all the other lower emission modes, right? Whether it's transit or micromobility. I think it's quite challenging for those micromobility operators, and not because I'm in the tech space and I really want, you know, these companies to survive, but just like there is this greater multiplier effect of the benefit they bring to neighborhoods. You can see the trips really being able to support localized staying at home shelter in place during COVID, for example, and they don't receive this nearly the same kind of benefit that private cars receive. So that I just want to put a +1 on that. And then the second thing I just want to say to your point, you know, your question, Micah, about trust, public trust, just think back to all the times when there's been a terrible disaster during, and like for whatever you think of the leaders at the time, you know, 9/11 was horrible tragedy. There was so much trust broken among the public about being out in New York, taking the train, being worried that it would happen again. And what did the leaders of the city do? They encouraged people to do those things. And I think that our leaders should be, you know, encouraging people to take transit right now. And frankly, there's an equity situation here too, where the people who are continuing to take transit are the people who don't have another option.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Yeah. Stephen, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, no, I think that I think that there's this, there's definitely a subsidy for private passenger vehicles. We see it in the prices of parking, and we understand the value of a square foot in a city, and it's kind of comical. Like if you want to sort of compare a square foot in a building versus a square foot in a parking space, I think it's kind of what I was getting at in terms of people understanding the value of curbs more than ever, or curb space more technically. You know, look at a restaurant. Its only way of operating is to be in a parking space, right? Look at the price of that parking space for that hour that now the restaurant is using it. And it's, you know, $5, $10 tops in an expensive city like New York per hour. At that same time, a restaurant is operating and has turned X tables with Y number of people paying, I'll just say $100 for their meal, right? And so it's just sort of comical, the disparity of the number of people served and the amount of revenue generated. Like if you were to look at sort of the taxes generated by that restaurant for that meal and blah, 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 I'm sure it dwarfs the parking revenue, right? So that's, I think, just highlights in a very clear way the value of that space. And to the point that was made here, the subsidy that is being provided, therefore, to the private passenger vehicle. And ultimately, it just boils down to what kind of a world do we want to live in, and particularly what kind of a city do we want to live in, right? And this idea of livability, right? It's hard to measure, but I think this is one way to get at it. And it's like, do we want to be prioritizing vehicles or people? Is kind of ultimately the choice here. And I like people more than vehicles. And I used to design cars at BMW.
Right.
But here you go.
Right. Well, I know we could probably spend a whole hour just on this one thread, but I want to kind of move on to autonomous vehicles, because it does feel like maybe this is the year that some of the air has been let out of the big balloon of hype around AVs. I think that our audience can probably imagine what autonomous cars might mean for them. But what do you think about some of the ripple effects of these changes and how they'll impact cities and surrounding ecosystems? Lily, you wanna take a stab at that?
Sure. Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought actually over the past year, and really, you know, as we've seen a lot of the changes in the autonomous vehicle market, and I actually feel like we should switch away from using the term AVs or autonomous vehicles and towards transportation automation, because I do think that the ripple effects, as you say, of these technologies and the concepts that they've brought forth could really reshape the way we think about the system and the ecosystem and the transportation that we use to get around cities. So, you know, everything from autonomous buses and platooning for longer distances to using sensing on vehicles on the street to detect pedestrians and cyclists more rapidly. And there's just so many different implications of that, from, you know, information and wayfinding to the way that the system operates. I do think that one of the key pieces that we're haven't solved and are continuing to think about a lot here in Los Angeles is workforce development and upskilling. Because if you think about transportation automation having broad impacts throughout the industry, that's where we really need to focus our attention, is to make sure that we're still creating good paying jobs that, you know, people can and have career pathways in. But they might need a little extra training or some mid-career, you know, credentialing to be able to be competitive in that environment. And I think that's a really key piece of what we need to sort of see as an industry-wide focus, is how to do that for public and private sector employees and job training programs.
It's a great point. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I thought 2019 was the year that autonomous, never mind. So, I mean, the way we look at it is you know, there's this sort of pragmatic today view of the world, right? Like what's happening today. And we in our business tend to focus on that because we believe we can affect today. And so, you know, from our perspective, you know, back to kind of turning streets into software, you know, that's important today. It helps human drivers to operate more effectively. Like Lyft is a customer of ours, uses our data to operate more efficiently along curb space and finding passenger pickup and drop off areas, for example, Revel, etc. So there are use cases today for human drivers, if you will, to use data and platforms like ours to operate more effectively. And from our perspective, it's you know, times 100 when it comes to autonomy. Like, you know, computer drivers need APIs and data and things like that to make decisions clearly. And so it goes from being sort of really important to, you know, critical, right? Like you can't operate a vehicle unless you have this kind of information. So from our perspective, it sort of just, it makes for potentially a more efficient use of the space than even today with human drivers using information more intelligently. But it's sort of a continuum, right? It's not a binary or sort of a, yeah. And so it's you know, there's, I think, a lot of speculation about how it will happen first and the average person's first experience of this, and, you know, the robo-taxi, et cetera. You know, my personal view, not being an autonomous industry analyst, is just that the sort of well-defined problems like long-haul trucking, where there are relatively fewer random variables, are going to be kind of where it happens first. And I think that, you know, my personal view is that jury's still out on how it will sort of show up on a street near you. But clearly, you know, if human drivers need software to operate more effectively today, computer drivers 100% absolutely do need that. And so it's just a continuum from our perspective. And I worry about autonomy. I clearly understand it requires a large amount of capital to create such a system, you know, hire the talent, build the hardware and all that good stuff. But I worry that it's kind of like electric vehicles. It's the thing on the horizon that everybody focuses on that distracts from actually making real progress and change today. And it sort of chews up too much time at conferences and events and like this, for example. And I'm certainly not accusing you of spending too much time on autonomy today.
One question. We had
but I think that's the danger, right? Is that people just get, it's another shiny ball. And I'm not saying it's not important or it's not real, etc. But I think it's important to put it in context and sort of give it its sort of fair share of attention.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And Shin-pei, I want your thoughts on this as well. I will say that just kind of building on Stephen's point, I think that there's a question around, once we achieve this inflection point, right, around transportation automation, electric vehicle adoption, who emerges as major players in owning the supporting infrastructure? And how should the public sector be thinking about private ownership of transportation infrastructure? And so I don't want to minimize that point, because I actually think that's really critical, and that there are probably some lessons to be learned in the first generation of ride-hail rollout. But Shin-pei, I'll defer to you on this.
Well, I agree with a lot of what was said, and I guess just to kind of emphasize a few different themes. One, I actually think are like creating the sustainable, equitable transportation ecosystem that we all want is a ongoing process. I mean, we have not arrived even today in the vision of what was meant to be in terms of creating access for everyone in an affordable way, right? So this is an ongoing process, and the principles in place that we continue to, I think, as a community, continue to refine and try to achieve on safety, on equity, on environmental impacts, continue to accrue. We've added greater understanding around its impact on public health. And I think those principles continue to take place as we move into a more automated transportation system. I really like the idea of kind of deconstructing some of the technologies and then being able to apply it in a way that really then lines up against these societal principles. Because I think similar to electric vehicles, the nightmare version is that we have a city full of automated vehicles and we're just surrounded by cars. Like, that is not the future that we're envisioning. We're envisioning greater utilization again, greater safety again. So all those principles are still in place. And then just on the point about, who owns this, I think this is, there's a lot to be sorted. I think the work that Lilly's group is doing is precisely the kind of, thing that needs to happen. ITS America sounds like with the Mobility on Demand Alliance, those are the kinds of, these are hard conversations. And the only kind of my angle on it, I'm now at Uber, but I was at a public transit philanthropy. I was at a sustainable bike advocacy group. And the thing that I've noticed is that there has always been a lot of federal money around the technology development for public agencies. There has been a lot of it, but very rarely have those actual products been achieved to the extent that they've been adopted by the consumer. So for example, apps, like we talk a lot about mobility as a service and transit agencies developing apps. That has been in play since the 90s. That has not taken hold. And I think there's something to be said about using public funds for something that the agencies are really set up to do well, which is to set the rules, set the performance outcomes, guide the development in the market, and let the tech companies do what they know how to do, which is to develop the platform. Ownership is I think will be a complex term, just as these companies have also challenged the idea of transportation as an asset that you need to own. They've turned it into a service that you can get. And so maybe there are ways, like new business models, that we should be thinking about and not be so worried about a polarization, but how we should be working together. Like, what are those new rules we need to make?
Great point, and great way to close this panel. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives with us. I hope that you've all filled out your census. I hope that you're registered to vote on November 3rd. And take good care, stay safe, be excellent to each other, and thank you.